My plan today is to tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about my book, and then take you inside to see some of its pages. In many respects, this book began when we first got to Japan. At that time, I was a graduate student at Tokyo University on a Mombusho scholarship. And I have a very vivid memory of my first meeting with my academic advisor, Professor Hiroshi Hara, who was one of two practicing architects on the faculty at Todai at the time. And this took place in his seminar room, which was in the old Seiken building, which stood where the National Art Center is now. And it was a very long, skinny room with a very long, skinny table. And he sat in the middle of the table on one side, and I sat in the middle of the table on the other. And he said to me in his very monotone voice, he said, "So, what is it you want to study?" And I said to him, "Well, I want to know, why do buildings in Japan look so strange?" Because to my North American eyes, so much was different. There were no consistent street walls, there were no s- consistent cornice lines, no material compatibility. Instead, the tops of the buildings had these strange angles. There was no geometric relationship between the buildings. There was neon everywhere. I just couldn't make heads or tails of it. So he said to me, not missing a beat, he said, "Well, if you want to understand the new, you have to look at the old." So that made perfect sense to me. And I made Minka farmhouses the subject of my master's thesis. But at the same time, it didn't really scratch the itch. And I was very lucky to figure out early on in my stay that Japan has a marvelous custom that 2 or 3 days before an architect hands over a new building to the client, they will host, many of them, it's by choice, will host an open house or a kengakukai. And so I made it my private curriculum to go to as many kengakukai as I possibly could. Because these architects, they invite everyone. They invite their colleagues, their professors, their family, their friends, journalists, and graduate students like me. So this gave me a chance to get up to speed very quickly on the contemporary architecture scene. And I got to see a whole range of new buildings, including a number of houses, some of which are actually in this book. Well, friends of mine in America got wind of what I was doing. They were editors at magazines and so forth, and they said to me, "Would you? Could you?" And I said, "Of course I can." And so I started writing about architecture. And since then, I've literally written hundreds of articles and now 10 books. So this book started with a very straightforward idea. I said to myself, if I could take the 100 most impactful, important houses designed by architects in Japan between 1945 and the present, what would that lineup look like? And as Horiuchi-san mentioned, you know, Ando-san very succinctly wrote in his foreword that I was looking for that unbroken chain of creativity that are embodied in houses in Japan. Well, this gave a natural structure to the book, and the book has 9 chapters, each one corresponding to a decade. And within each chapter, there are profiles of the houses I selected from that decade. Profiles consist of written texts that I wrote, as well as a range of drawings and photos. And what I was looking for were the houses that had novel ideas, but a lasting impact. I was looking for the thoroughbreds. I wasn't looking for the zebras. But more than architectural concepts and construction technology, what I really wanted to capture was, what was the experience of these houses? What was it like to live here, to be here? Well, to investigate this, I needed to talk to people. And of course, the first line was to talk to the architects whenever possible. But many of the architects whose works are included in the book are no longer living. So I talked to their staff members. I talked to their professors or their students. Rather, I talked to their family members. I talked to the clients when I could. And in one case, I spoke to the client's housekeeper. All of their wonderful anecdotes and descriptions are embedded in my texts. Another way that I got at this, and this is a unique feature of this book, was I invited people from each decade to submit what we are calling at home essays. And these were written by people who actually lived in the homes. In some cases, it was the architects themselves. In some cases, it was the children of the architects, now grown. In other cases, it was the clients. For example, we have a wonderful essay from Michiko Uchida about growing up in the house designed by her father, Kenzo Tange. Fumihiko Maki and his daughter Naomi shared their memories of the Niseitai Jutaku, the two-generation house that Maki-san designed first for himself and his wife and his parents, and then now his daughter and her family, and Maki-san and his wife. And Katsuhiro Miyamoto, an architect in Kansai, wrote a wonderful piece about his family home. His family had been living in this home in Takarazaka since the early 20th century. It was a small wooden house. And after the great Hanshin earthquake in 1995, it was very, very drastically injured, to use the metaphor. And so the government wanted to tear it down, and he was going to go along with it. And then he said, well, wait a minute. If we tear down this house, what goes is not just the house, but all the memories and all the family time it embodies. So instead, he inserted a rather bold white steel structure to hold the whole house together. And he renamed it appropriately House Surgery. Well, all of the people who submitted essays were very kind and also provided us with snapshots and informal photos that showed the homes in action. But the vast majority of the 544 illustrations had to be unearthed by me and my photo sourcer. We used only existing images and existing drawings. These were made at the time of construction or the time of completion. So the book has a parallel visual narrative where you see at the beginning, the photos are beautiful black and white images and hand-drawn plans. And then by the end, the photos are color and the data has all gone digital. Many of the most iconic images of houses in Japan are in this book. But even more importantly, we found many photos that were long forgotten and others which have never been seen before. Well, I'm often asked, why does the book begin in 1945? Well, obviously, that was the year the war ended and Japan's reconstruction began. And as many people know, physically, the loss of homes was really catastrophic. There was a very urgent need to rebuild. But there wasn't much money, there weren't many materials, and that made the problem even more intense. This was partly offset by measures taken by the Japanese government, including home loans for homeowners who wanted to rebuild. It was also a time of tremendous political and social change, which had impacts on house design. Among them, there was a shift from the traditional patriarchal multi-generation family living in one building to the nuclear family unit based on the Western model of two parents and two children. Another major point of contention was the traditional use of space where sleeping and eating could occur in the same room. But in the post 1945 Japan, this was deemed unhygienic. The two had to be separated. So for architects, this wasn't just a time to modernize the house. This was a time to start thinking about what could the house be. Now I have to figure out how to do this. So one of the um, important early thinkers was an architect named Kiyoshi Ikebe. And one of his basic moves was to say, we're going to put the kitchen in the middle of the house. Previously, it had been relegated to a dark corner, maybe even the doma, the transitional space between inside and out. It wasn't a place of gathering, it was a place of preparing food. But his idea was, let's put it in the middle. It will become the gathering point for this new nuclear family, and it will place women at the center of the home. Because, of course, women were doing more of the work in the kitchen at that time. This is Ikebe's house number 1. He never named the houses, he just ordered them in number. And it was created in 1948 in compliance with the restrictions that I mentioned that for materials and size to qualify for a government loan. And as you can see, it's made out of wood, concrete block, and glass, which were materials that were relatively affordable and attainable at the time. And it complied with the size limit, which was about 540 square feet, which to our way of thinking would be quite small. But for Ikebe, he didn't view this as a hardship. On the contrary, one of Ikebe-san's most beloved architectural spaces was the traditional tea room, as his daughter told me. And of course, as we know, those are very small rooms, small spaces, designed for carefully choreographed sequence of movements. So that efficiency really appealed to him. The house has a slanted roof, as you can see here. And okay, so these are two different sectional drawings, the one on the left and the one on the right. That's a vertical slice right down through the building. But if you look on the left, you can see there's the slanted roof. And that was a motif that appeared again and again in Ikebe's work. But what it did was it enabled him, even in this tiny little building, to create some hierarchy by raising the ceiling in different places and then creating a mezzanine where he could actually place the sleeping quarters and provide a modicum of privacy. By the 1950s, the immediate crisis had waned, restrictions had loosened, and commissions for architects were expanding. This is a sky house, which was designed by an architect named Kiyonori Kikutake in 1958 for his own family. And essentially, it was one large square room that he hoisted up on these massive concrete pillars. And it was wrapped on all 4 sides with a covered porch reminiscent of the traditional engawa. Within the space, furniture and flexible, movable partitions could separate functional zones. Another way he divided the space was with the creation of something he called the MoveNet, which were boxes that could literally be moved around the perimeter in that Engawa type space and plugged in at various points. One contained the bathroom and one contained the kitchen, which you see here. How often they actually moved them? Unknown, but an interesting idea nonetheless. As the family grew, there was a need for more MoveNets, and these became wooden boxes that were suspended from that floor. And these were children's bedrooms, of course. And when I showed this photo to the architect's daughter, she was just delighted to see it. She said it was the best room a child could have. It was perfectly sized. She was separated from her parents. She was very happy, well, living in this room. Well, by the 1960s, situation had changed. Japan was solidly on the up and up. The country was gearing up to host the 1964 Olympics. The economy was growing rapidly, and consumers now had disposable income. This meant they could afford to build homes that did more than satisfy basic needs. In the words of the architect Kazuo Shinohara, a house could be a work of art. This is his umbrella house, which is a good illustration of his statement. One of the ideas that was very much on Shinohara's mind at this stage in his career, which most of his career he did focus quite a lot on houses, was how does one blend tradition and this new modernism? And as you can see, you know, he did bring in a lot of traditional ideas. There's Fusuma, which you see on the left, sliding paper panels, and Sudare shades, which are here used to divide a room, as well as the roof beams exposed and resembling the spokes of a traditional umbrella. Those all have a traditional character, but at the same time, white walls and a lot of interior light and a state-of-the-art kitchen pointed towards the new modern world. Well, one of the book's most compelling houses is this home called White U that was designed by Toyo Ito in 1976 for his sister and her two daughters. The young family had been living in an apartment close by, but when his sister's husband passed away at a very young age, they wanted to move into their own home near the homestead where Ito and his sister had grown up. Fortunately, this land was available and he was able to create a home for them. And as you can imagine, when it was completed, most of the neighbors weren't really sure what it was. Um, but what he wanted to make was a building where this grieving family would feel very nurtured and very sheltered. And so it's literally a U-shaped tube of concrete, and it surrounds. I, I hesitate to call it a courtyard because it wasn't a space that one went into. It was a space that one looked at, and it wasn't planted. It was left as simply dirt. Um, Within the building, there were actually very few walls, just where they were needed for functional reasons or privacy. Instead, different usages just flowed from one to the other, which was quite a contrast with this hard shell exterior. Well, after 20 years, the daughters had grown up, and the family no longer felt a need to live in a home that was built out of a sense of grief. And yet they couldn't imagine that anyone else could possibly live in such a personal space. So the house was demolished in 1997. It's strange to think that a concrete house could be taken down after just 21 years. But perhaps it's equally strange to think that a house made with paper could stand for that length of time or perhaps even longer. To prove this point, the architect Shigeru Ban built Paper House in 1995. Ostensibly, it was his own weekend home. But anyone who knows Shigeru knows he doesn't take weekends off. The real purpose of this house was to demonstrate the structural capability of the lowly paper tube. He needed to prove that, yes, paper tubes could hold up a roof. Since that time, he has used them in buildings of various sizes in various countries, and often for the humanitarian work that he engages in at disaster sites all over the globe. Here, the tubes form this S-shaped wall. In the upper left-hand corner, you see it encircling the bath, which has its own little garden with a tree. And then it comes around and encloses the space on the right, which were the sleeping quarters, and then swoops around to open the living area to the outdoors. Well, one thing that mattered greatly to Bond was blurring the boundary between inside and out. And he did that by enclosing this square building with movable partitions on all four sides. Um, Bond has a tremendous enthusiasm for architecture with moving parts. The Swatch building in Ginza is a great example at a larger scale. And he also likes to nod politely to certain traditions from Japanese architecture. Another non-urban example is the 4x4 house, which had a very unusual beginning. It started in 2001 when Brutus magazine held a contest. They asked readers to submit on a postcard their dream architect. And if selected, the contestant would provide the land and the funding, and Brutus would negotiate with the architect. Well, the winner was a construction company executive. He had a tiny property overlooking the Seto Inland Sea, and his wish was to live in a house designed by Tadao Ando. Well, Ando responded with a concrete mini tower topped with a 4x4 meter cube. The private rooms were in the 3 stories below: bedrooms, bath, study. And then the communal space, the combined living room, dining room, kitchen, are housed in the cube. Clearly, the client was unfazed by the idea of carrying groceries up to the top floor. But I can tell you that it was a good choice because this room has spectacular views, the best light, and you don't even know that there's a 4-lane highway behind. Well, challenging city sites offer opportunities for architects to, oh, there you see a view looking out. And that's the sea and the bridge, which is spectacular. So anyhow, I was going to say that challenging city sites are often a form of stimulus for architects as well. This is a house in Tokyo called House in a Plum Grove. I know you're wondering where are the plum trees. Well, we'll get to that. It was a very small site, and the architect Kazuyo Sejima was approached by the client, which was a couple. They had 2 kids, 1 live-in grandmother, and this tiny plot that at that time was dotted with plum trees. Well, as you can sort of see, the land it's a corner plot, and on one side there was a parking lot, and on the other side a teeny pocket playground. Pretty typical conditions for Tokyo. Well, the client really wanted to keep the trees, but of course, this made the small site even smaller. And full disclosure, they were removed during construction. And this is a photo taken shortly after the completion of the building. But in that little L-shaped black top area there, the trees were replanted eventually. And now they're like growing like gangbusters. So faced with a very tight condition, most architects say, well, I'm going to divide the space as little as possible. Sejima saw things slightly differently. She reasoned that the more rooms, the better. So this poker-faced exterior wrapping conceals a rather remarkable interior. It holds 3 stories, which contain a variety of communal spaces, including a library, tea room, and a rooftop bathroom. In addition, there are individual rooms for each family member. But the rooms were sized by the furniture. So you see the son here in his bedroom, which is literally the width of his bed. Um, Now, that might make some people slightly claustrophobic. So she punched holes in the walls, which are made of this very thin steel sheet, both looking out and internally, so that the son and the daughter's study, which is, of course, the size of her desk, is right in that room. And so they could, call down to each other or throw spitballs or whatever they did. And it was really quite a remarkable conclusion. Well, in closing, I want to leave you with one more house. And this is called House Restaurant. And it was completed in 2022. It was designed by Sejima's disciple, Junya Ishigami, who I think is one of the most fearless architects working in Japan today. This commission came from a chef who had land in Yamaguchi Prefecture. And what he wanted was a building that combined his home and his restaurant with the atmosphere of a wine cellar. Well, instead of the conventional building upward with columns and beams, Ishigami dug holes into the ground. And these holes became the molds for poured in place concrete. Now, this was an extremely daring strategy because he had absolutely no idea what kind of space he was creating until the concrete had cured, which took about a month, and all the dirt could be excavated from around it, which took even longer. And when it was done, he was so impressed with it that he decided to leave the concrete in this kind of rough state. His original idea had been, oh, I'll smooth it over, put some kind of coating on it. But he said, no, 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 no. I love the cragginess. I love the color. And so they just put a clear sealant on it. So what he did was he put the home on one side. And here you see the sunken bathtub. Of course, it's sunken. And then the restaurant on the other. And here is the, chef's counter cooking area with seats for the patrons so they can banter back and forth while the food is being prepared. And then in between, he placed 3 courtyards that both bring light into the center of the building and create a buffer between public and private. Well, this is just a very small sampling of the what's inside the book. And I invite you, in fact, there are books for sale in back, to take a look at the other 90 houses, 90 plus houses in the book. As you'll see, each one tells a special story about the time it was built, about the place that molded its form, and above all, about the people who brought it to life and made it a home. Thank you.
I'd like to start my question. Which is the most unusual house you encountered?
Well, as I said, I was really interested in not the strangest houses. I wanted houses that had some more meaning to them as opposed to just making just shock value. But there is a house in Shibuya I think it's called White Ellipse, and it looks like a giant white balloon. It doesn't look at all like a house. It's some kind of fiberglass exterior, and it was created by the client was a very young guy, and he just said to the architect, build me something, and it brushes shoulders with bars and love hotels, and I'm sure it blends right in.
Thank you, Naomi-san, for that wonderful presentation. My name is Masako Egawa. If a student, maybe college student, would ask you the exact same question you asked Hara Sensei, how I know it's very difficult to summarize, but how would you describe, how would you answer to the why Japanese houses are strange?
Oh, how would I, if I answer my own question, in other
Yes,
words?
you posed a question to
Right,
Hara sensei.
right,
And
right, right,
if a student
right.
today asks you the same question, and you know, she may not, he or she may not be able to read the whole book.
Sure,
So,
sure, sure. Well, I think that, the conventions that we are so embedded in the idea of the house in the West. For example, in America, we would never, ever, ever put the kitchen on the fourth floor. It just would never happen. But here, they're just these rules don't exist. They're not essential anymore. And that gives tremendous freedom both to the architects, to the clients. I think that homes in Japan that are created by architects tend to be far more personalized. And that creates this incredible richness of possibility.
I'm Seiichi Kondo, former ambassador to UNESCO. Thank you, Naomi-san, for a very interesting talk. I have two interrelated questions, if I may. One, architects have been playing a very important role in formulating philosophy of life, philosophy of culture, such as modernism, postmodernism. But I don't know what postmodernism is, because modernism, I know what that is, but postmodernism doesn't define anything positively. It is something after modernism. So how would you define postmodernism? That's my first question. And a related question is, why do you think Japanese architects are so playing very important role these days? And do you see any sort of relationship between the current of philosophy of life these days and the role played by Japanese architects?
Well, I'm going to start by answering your second question, which, you know, in the immediate post war years, um, and I'm speaking partly from the architecture point of view and partly a lot from the design point of view, in other words, more objects. Japan had a little bit of an issue with originality. And a lot of the work that was coming out of Japan was very derivative or straight up copies of things that were happening in the West. And very happily, the Japanese government stepped in the 1950s and created something called the Good Design Award, which was intended to elevate originality and innovation. And I think that people began to really see that that was Japan's role. Also, again, it's partly in the design world. There were some foreigners who came over to Japan to educate. And for example, Bruno Taut, he said to people, don't copy. You've got such richness here of craft capability, of aesthetics. Use your own and modernize it, but use your own. And I think that that point of view has really infiltrated everything that gets designed. And over the years, Japan really evolved from a place in terms of architecture and design, from a country of imitators to a country of innovators. And the whole world looks to Japan to see what is the new thing, what is the inventive thing, what is the innovation. So I think Japan's role in the world of architecture and design has changed radically over the course of this book, and I think that it continues to be that way. And in terms of postmodernism, well, that was kind of an odd moment in the architecture world, which came about in the 1980s when it was this strong expression, this rejection of everything modern, and we're going to make it different. We're going to make it colorful. We're going to make it expressive. We're going to make it almost cartoon like. And the truth is, that just didn't really resonate. There's some amazing buildings that were built during that time, but as a that was not a movement that had real longevity. We see vestiges of it here and there, but overall, it was not a very meaningful moment in architectural history, in my opinion.
I'm John Gray. A question about kind of durability. I think, in my experience in Japan, many homes are built to be single generational, or in a rare case, multiple generational. God bless the younger generation that has to live with the parents. How have you seen that evolve over this post-war period? And I think there's an element of, when I talk to people about homes here, they say, well, we'll tear it down, when we're done. And that kind of skite stay, let's throw it away when it's done. How has that evolved, or has it evolved? And to what extent have there? So there are two questions. An embedded question: have the use of materials changed? And I know that in Meiji period and in Taisho, people were much more concerned about putting out the blossoms of Tokyo and fireproofing and making sure things were earthquake proof. Has that created any kind of limitation on the creativity in homes, or what kind of innovations have you seen, in that process leading up to now that has helped both ensure durability, but also safety of the homes that are being constructed now?
Well, for a long time, wooden homes were prohibited in Tokyo. And then gradually that has loosened. And now there are some more hybrid versions that are coming about. I would say, more than fire, earthquakes are the real issue. And every time there's a major earthquake, the earthquake code gets stricter. And the architects throw up their hands and say, oh my God, what are we going to do now? And yet, I think it was Shigeru Ban who said this to me. He said, the worst thing for an architect is a blank slate. The best thing are having limitations, because that forces you to think creatively. So I think that is definitely, every time I hear someone complain that, oh, the code has just gotten worse, I'm like, okay, well, so, do with it what you will. I'm sure you'll do something great. And that is what happens. In terms of the viability of houses over time, there's definitely, I'd like to think it's a bigger movement than it is. And I try to touch on this in the book by having some examples in the final chapter that point the way of different ways that people are thinking. And even the anecdote I shared with you about house surgery, that way of thinking of, how can we keep old houses that have, it's growing, but it's young architects, it's young clients who are willing to undertake those challenges. And, part of both a blessing and a curse, going back to structure, is that there are regular inspections of old buildings. And I'm not really sure how this works with houses exactly, because a lot of them don't stick around. But, there's the need to retrofit for structure often, which can be a very expensive thing. But I think that especially younger generations are recognizing the value of older homes and want to hang on to them. There have been a couple of cases recently where homes from the 60s and 70s were purchased by, well, there was one that was purchased by an actress, and she restored it. And so there's a little bit of that. It got a lot of attention, which is a wonderful thing. And so I think that, we may see houses that are going to last longer, but that gets into the whole idea of materials again, where, and that relates to the previous question, where there's a lot of innovation here. And part of that innovation is with materials. Someone like Bond, the idea of building with paper, who would have thunk it? And then, a lot of other architects experiment with materials. And so it's kind of goes both ways. On the one hand, how can some of these materials really sustain over time? And yet, isn't it wonderful that someone's looking at the construction possibilities of some of these materials?
Takehito from Sophia University. Thank you so much for wonderful to understand wonderful history of Japanese houses. My question will be about external factors which have influenced architect or people of the owners. For example, earthquake or World Expo, Olympics, so many historical events have also influenced Japanese houses. From your perspective, what kind of a historical event in Japan have influenced architecture and people in architecture? Thank you.
Um, that's a tough question. I'm not sure actually that house design has been that impacted by historical events. One very visible one was in the construction of large roadways for the 1964 Olympics. You know, they're just sort of run through neighborhoods without much consideration to the impact on who's living there. And we've seen that in a number of places, Yamatedori, Kiradori, as you know, it's the unfortunate nickname. But sometimes these create catalysts. There can be catalysts for invention again. So, for example, both of those cases, they're tiny, tiny triangular plots, but just get left when you run a road through someone's property. And those properties tend to be pretty inexpensive, so younger people might be able to buy them. Or the most famous one, of course, is Tower House, which is across from the Watarium Museum. And that was built in 1966. And the architect said, I have a choice. I can either go and live in a 2-story house with a yard, 90 minutes away, or I can have this teeny tiny plot right in the center of the city. And he said, there is no question in my mind. The architect and his wife said, we want to stay here. And so they have been, for years, they just enjoyed the riches of the city, but basically used the city in many ways to expand their own living space. And that's a wonderful thing. That engagement with the city, I think, is one of the really strong parts of some of these homes in Japan that, need to rely on the city, but it's a kind of a, mutual relationship.
Hi, good morning. My name is Kenji Govars. I want to go back to the U-shaped house that you showed earlier because that triggered a thought in my mind. It's about preserving homes and houses in Japan. I think a lot of us would agree that, it's a very good thing to preserve houses and, obviously, especially the old Japanese houses in the countryside and, the one that are about to be destroyed and all the IKEA in the world and stuff like that. And I'm a big fan of that as well. But I'd like to hear the perspective of the architect. And what I mean by that is this architect built a house, as you said, very eloquently, for a family that was grieving. And then the family is not grieving anymore after 20 years, then the house has achieved its function. So what do we do with the house, right? So do you give it to another family which is not grieving at all? So in that case, doesn't make any sense for them, right? Or do you actually destroy it? And so again, the preserving part of me says, please don't destroy it, just keep it.
Right.
But then the architect of the family would say, well, actually, no, we don't need it anymore. Therefore, we just destroy it. So I just wonder, this issue of preservation at all costs in many ways, is that something that all the architects would actually agree with? Or actually it just depends on, what function for what family and for what event it was built for. Therefore, it just depends on the history of that house.
Well, I mean, that's an extreme version, but so many houses, especially houses designed by architects, are very personalized and very much, address the needs of that particular client. So, is there a market for a house with a kitchen on the 4th floor? I don't know. You know, um, so there is that aspect of it. You know, I've asked architects about this, and some of them have given me a very crass answer, which is, well, if that house comes down, that creates work for me, you know? And but truly, that is one point of view. Now, does any architect really want to see a house they've designed come down? No. I mean, there's tremendous investment in making these homes and making these buildings. And so I think it's just a matter of, people getting used to the idea of living in a house that has already been lived in. And does a house have a longevity beyond the cycle of one generation? And sometimes, these houses get torn down or get modified because of the inheritance tax. So a piece of land, the parents die, the kids would like to keep the house, but they can't because the inheritance tax is too high. So they have to tear down the house, sell part of the land, and then maybe, if they're lucky, they get to build a house on the smaller piece of land that's left. So it's an economic decision as well as a habitual one.
Morning. This is Nachi. I'm an entrepreneur. Thank you for a delightful presentation. So, after the pandemic, a lot of people are choosing to spend more time outside the city. They're buying second houses there or moving there. At the same time, we see a spurt of high rises also, especially in Tokyo, kind of contrasting movements. Where do you see, from your vantage point, where do you see architecture evolving in Japan, in Tokyo, particularly in the context of these similar movements happening elsewhere?
Particularly in the context of
These similar trends happening elsewhere, in the US, for example.
the trend being people spending more time outside the city.
Outside the city, but at the same time trying to balance nature and high rises, trying to balance these demands of a shifting population.
Well, that's a big question. I think the whole world was pretty shaken up in many ways in a positive way by COVID. And we learned we could do things from a distance. We learned we could live outside the city and still have access to the city. And I don't think we're ever going back. I don't know. I mean, I'm absolutely gobsmacked when I come to Tokyo and I see all these boom cranes everywhere. I don't really know, how this can continue and who's living in these places, but I don't know. I hear that a lot of the apartments are being sold to non-Japanese, so maybe that's what's going on. Second homes in Japan have a different history than they do in the West. For a long time, people who wanted second homes basically built in what are called besochi, so designated land for second homes where services were provided, sometimes construction could be provided, a little bit, well taken care of. Water was already there. The idea of just going and building a house by a lake was sort of not so much the practice, but, perhaps that's changing now. Again, I think that we're going to see younger clients with different desires and wishes from their parents. So we'll see how it plays out. But, one of Tokyo's greatest gifts is it's a vast city, but the small, with relative, well, this is my point, is that we're losing the small scale. It's a vast city of small scale buildings. And as that goes, we lose the character of the city. And that's something I'm lamenting.
It's Johnny.
Hi, Johnny.
Hi. I think, you're Japanese in many ways. You've been here so long. And you always keep very understated, and you're not as recognized and acclaimed as you should be. And in addition to the legacy of the book, which is great and amazing, you have also served, I may be misunderstood, but you've also served as a producer of architecture, or a bridge between the client and the architect. And some of the buildings in Tokyo are also your legacy, like the Jewish Community Center. Is this correct? And are there other buildings that you've been facilitated or bridged or produced?
Well, mainly it's my friends who want to build houses. And I've had many friends over the years ask me who, and I say, do you want to live in a house that works or a house that's a work of art? And then based on that, I'll make recommendations. The only really visible project is the Dior building on Omotesando. When that building was going to be rebuilt, Dior came to me and said, we want a light image. We want a female designer. Tell us who. And they picked my first choice, so that was good. That was Kazuo Sejima.
Thank you. That's great. So, there's more than a book in your legacy.
Thank you. Well, they didn't build it exactly as Sejima planned, but that's another matter. So.
Great. Naomi-san, we have some questions from the online world. Would you please speak about the vulnerable aspect of tatami mat floors, but does have a satisfaction of walking on them? And then that follows to, do you see the spiritual link between the modern houses designed in Japan today and the historical small traditional architecture like tea ceremony houses or a building like Katsura Rikyu Villa? Which was kind of rediscovered by Bruno Taut. Can you kind of talk about those two aspects, about material and then also the spiritual factor about the Japanese houses?
Well, that's the spiritual factor really speaks very directly, that question, to what I was experiencing in those early days when I was spending, Monday to Friday working on Minka farmhouses and Saturday and Sunday going to Kengakai. And I would go to see these houses and my eye was being trained to look at the elements of the traditional Japanese house. And I would walk in and I'd say, oh, it's so traditional, And I would say to the architect, which houses did you look at? Which traditional houses did you look at? What was your influence? And they were like, tradition? What? And they didn't see a connection at all. But I, reminded them, well, you have this step at the entrance. So you're separating, interior and exterior. People are taking off their shoes. There's a combined living, dining, kitchen, or a space that can be reconfigured with movable partitions. To me, the parallels were pretty obvious. So I think that there are certain ways of being at home that are still very much based on the history of Japan. In terms of tatami and its vulnerability, well, one of my beliefs is that the Japanese, there's so much about houses that is the same around the world, and then there are so many parts that are just not quite congruent. And the floor is definitely one of them. In the West, the floor is a surface simply for walking on. We place things on the floor. It's a very passive element in the house in that regard. But in Japan, the floor is a much more active element, even in a contemporary house, where people sit on the floor, people sleep on the floor. And that is even underscored, more by having tatami mats, which are such a wonderful tactile experience. And sometimes now people are looking for, well, not tatami mats per se, but something that evoke that sensibility about having the body close to the floor. In the West, we separate ourselves from the floor. In Japan, that's not at all the case. I remember meeting with an architect who also designs furniture, and he designed this sofa. And the sofa was, it had the back where you could sit against it in the seat, and then the bottom part where the feet were was also upholstered. And I said to him, why'd you do that? And he said, well, a lot of people are going to sit on the floor and just lean up against the sofa. So we've found new ways in Japan to integrate the floor. So I'm not sure that answers the question about tatami, but it certainly, the importance of the floor can't be underestimated.
Thank you. Here's another question from Koji Muranaka-san. He says, what kind of changes do you see in Japanese houses as the society matured in the last several decades?
Well, I have to think about that for a minute. We certainly are seeing changes in the family constellation and who lives together. What is a shared home? There was a whole bunch of these shared homes that have been built in the last few years where unrelated people are just living together. And it's not just a matter of renting a room, it's a matter of creating a home together. So we're seeing socially a lot of changes, and that has impacts for the shape and function of space in a residential place. And, you know, that would be one of the main ones that I see as changing. I think that there's a move away from the multi-generation living. I, found it in recent years. I see fewer and fewer multi-generation houses being built. That's not that there aren't any, but just there's a trend, I think, away from that. So I would say the main changes that I see that could be explained quickly are social ones.
Thank you. Here's another question. This is with regards to architectural design. Which aspect or aspects of Japanese architectural design do you think could best be adopted and even adapted in mainstream American or Western architecture?
Well, that's easy. I mean, there are many, but I think that for me, the most obvious one is that we have this point of view in America in particular that bigger is better. And Japan proves again and again and again that the quality of space has nothing to do with the quantity of space. And so I think people could be a lot more circumspect about how much space do they really need and how much space does it take to make a house a home. And it's actually not very much. So.
Great. Here's another question. Do you have insight into what younger architects are interested in these days and how they are solving some concerns of society in a different way from the current or previous masters of architecture?
Well, I do think that younger architects are beginning to think about environmentalism and how can we make more energy sensitive choices as we design. Something that Japanese architects have always been good at, they don't necessarily practice it, is the use of natural ventilation and where you place windows. Even in houses that are, blocked in by other houses, there will be a separate set of windows just for ventilation. And they're not meant for view. They're up high, they're down low, but they draw air through the home. So I think that, Japanese architects have had some sensibility, and maybe now younger designers are a little bit more concerned about it. The other area that I do see some, and this gets back to one of the earlier questions, one of the houses in the book, it did not start with an old house. They took an old building at an academic institution nearby, and they took parts of the building and integrated them into the house. And I'm forgetting the word, but there is a word. It comes from actually ancient Greek or Roman architecture where people would literally take parts of buildings and integrate them into their new building. And that's what this particular practice is really interested in doing. They're not saying, well, we're going to save every old building, but we're going to take parts of old buildings and reuse them. And why not? So I think that there's some move towards valuing the pre-existing.
Okay, and lastly, this is from Yamamuro-san. He says, today, buying houses in big cities looks like only for the rich. It's not just in Tokyo, but it's globally. And, it's not about architecture, but what do you think about the whole circumstances around that to build a house in a city?
Well, actually, I think compared to a lot of other places, for example, the United States, I think that architectural services are far more affordable here. And partly why that, that's just the nature of the pay scale, but it's also sometimes I find that younger clients are buying the land that no one else wants. It's those triangular plots. It's the, slice of land next to a cemetery. And a lot of people would just, if they could build a house, they would just get a housemaker house, which is a kit house, basically. They come at various different levels of quality. But those houses don't fit on a lot of these awkward, strange shaped plots. So they need an architect to sort of design them out of their fix. And so I do think that buying less expensive land, which is available, and I think it's actually a much more affordable option here than it is elsewhere.
Michio Nakamoto, thank you for your very interesting talk. I can't help but think that some of these houses must be very difficult to live in. So I'm wondering if you can share any stories about people saying, well, actually, having built this, we're having second thoughts. And also I'm wondering, is there something about Japanese culture that all these people are willing to build strange houses that are difficult to live in? I mean, is that rooted in tradition or something?
So the immediate story that comes to mind, and I'm not going to identify the architect, but the client was a friend of mine, and I did not advise her on this house at all, but I did get to see the house at various points. And this woman has 4 children, and she kept saying to the architect, I need more storage in my kitchen. I need more storage in my kitchen. And he kept saying, oh yeah, we'll give you storage. We'll give you storage. She never got her storage. It just interfered with his aesthetic point of view, which gets back to my, do you want a house that works or a house that's a work of art? She did choose one of the work of art types of architects. At the other end of the extreme, I had interviewed an architect once who designed a house for, it was a physician couple, and they both worked crazy hours, and everything had to be efficient. So they had a closet that was like a conveyor belt at a dry cleaner. And they didn't even have a dryer. They took their clothes out damp and hung it on here, and it just spun around. And then the architect, she found them a dishwasher with the absolute shortest cycle on the planet. I think it was 6 minutes. So efficiency, it sometimes goes the other way. I do think that there's a kind of, sensei underling relationship that exists in lots of fields in Japan, and one doesn't question. And I think that that has played into a lot of architect-client relationships here. Again, we come back to work of art, house that works. I remember when I first met Maki-san, and I called him Maki-sensei, and he said, I do not like to be called sensei. And younger architects are also the same way. It's like, sensei? Really? So I think that perhaps, again, there's a little bit more equality that's developing in that relationship, but a lot of people are just willing to be sort of, put themselves, especially with architects, I don't know what color I want. I don't know what I want, do with me what you will. And so there's a lot of that kind of mentality. Whereas the architect who designed the house with the conveyor belt closet, she said to me that she felt that her job was half design and half psychiatry. So she had to figure out, who are these people and what do they really want? And she put her effort into that as opposed to, making the most magazine-worthy buildings. I think they were thrilled, except when it broke.
Hi, my name is Namiko Yamauchi, and thank you very much. This is the best way to start the beautiful day. Wow. My question is simple. How did you decide to pick one of those for your cover, that picture?
Oh, the cover. Well, the truth be told, it was a collaborative decision between me, my publisher, and the book designer. And we did look at some other options, but I felt very, very, very strongly that we needed to have an older house on the front and a newer house on the back. And so I picked out a bunch of photos from our Wello photos, and I said, any of these would work for me. And then they chose this one, and I said, great, I love it. So, sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the end time is approaching. I would like to conclude today's session. Naomi-san, thank you very much again for your informative and insightful speech. So everyone, please give her a big hand again. Thank you very much.